Hello. In this video, we're going to learn about the JavaFX classes WebView and the accompanying class WebEngine. All right, so I have a few classes to walk you through the code of. The first one is a class called WebView Example. It's kind of the introduction to the WebView class. So WebView, as you might have guessed, it's an application class, and it allows you to view HTML content, whether that's from a local file or from the internet at large. As usual, in these projects, we begin by extending the application class. We have our standard public static void main. We launch our application. Because we're extending the application class, we must always implement the start method, which takes a stage as a parameter. This is our first WebView example. This is going to be a pretty basic example. So as a layout manager, I'd like to use a VBox, which will arrange the contents vertically in a column. I'm setting the spacing of that VBox to be 16. So there'll be 16 pixels of space in between each element that's added to the VBox. And finally, I'm adding a little bit of style to this container. I'd like all the content to be more easily readable, so I'm using a little bit of CSS to increase the default font size to 16 point. Once I've decided on the layout manager, I'm going to go ahead and create a scene object using that root layout manager. And finally, I need to attach the scene to the stage. Now we're ready to begin the real customized code of our application. The first class we need is the WebView. And it takes no parameters, and we'll set a default size, a preferred size, to be 800 by 600. Now, this preferred size is subject to change because the window is resizable. If we were to, say, shrink the window so it's smaller than 800 by 600 pixels, the WebView would also resize itself. And that's why this is set pref size, set the preferred size. We're not enforcing a minimum or maximum size here. And next, there's a technical line of code which we need to include just to suppress some warnings which might occur. Right. To begin, I'd like to start off by loading the google.com website, and I'll temporarily store that as a string. And in concert with our WebView object, we are going to get something called a WebEngine. And we get that directly from the WebView object. So browser.getEngine. This is kind of similar to some previous classes you may have learned about. For example, if we were doing graphics in JavaFX, or in many computer systems, to do graphics, we often require a canvas element, and then operations on that canvas are performed through an associated graphics context object. So we would initialize a canvas, and then we would get the context object from that canvas. Kind of similar here. We don't initialize the WebEngine from the WebEngine class. We're not creating a new WebEngine. We just get it from our pre-existing browser object. And then, well, what are we going to do? We're going to load this URL. We just have to pass it in as a string. And that's most of what we need here. Of course, we also need to add all the different things to our site, which we will. We'd also like this very elementary web browser to be somewhat interactive. So we'd also like to add a text field, which will allow the user to enter a new website they would like to visit. I'll call that URL text. That'll be a new text field, and we'll display that default URL we chose. Finally, there's a few ways we can navigate to a new site. One of them might be to type in a new URL into the text field and press enter. Another way would be to create a button you click on once you've finished entering the website address. In a real application, you probably want to let the user use either method to navigate to a new URL. For this simple application, we'll just say you have to click on a button. So for our URL button, we'll set an action to run, And as often is the case, we will express that action with a lambda expression. Right? When that action occurs, when the button is clicked, we'll retrieve the text which was entered in that text field, and then we'll load that into our web engine. Finally, another common feature of websites is to have some kind of a back button. Right? So we'll create a new button which contains the text back. And when you click on that button, we'll set an associated action, again expressed using a lambda expression. The action is the web engine will actually execute some code. This is actually really interesting, and we'll have another example which focuses on this functionality later on. But we're asking the web engine to execute the code which is contained in this string. Right? There's a global history object, and we're having it execute its back method. Within the web engine, that will return the user to the previous website that they visited. Finally, we've created all these objects, but we have not yet added them. So remember that we had a VBox named root, and that will arrange all the contents of our website vertically. It's not the best layout, but again, we're looking at very basic functionality as a first pass. We'll start off by adding the text field where the user can enter a website they'd like to go to, followed by the button, which the user can click on to go to the URL they entered here. Then a back button, which lets the user return to the previous site. And finally, the WebView object itself, which we had called browser. And always, once you've set up your window, you always need to remember to show the main stage. And that is it. That is really it. All the basic functionality that you need to create a working web browser in JavaFX. Next, we're going to go ahead and run that code. It's nothing fancy to look at, but it is functional. All right, and here we have our very basic website. Make this a little bit larger. And again, we haven't really done anything fancy with the formatting here. We just have a text field, which is stretching to fill up the entire site. Everything is left aligned in our VBox because we did not say to center it. So that's why the alignment might look a little bit odd. But you might notice this is, in fact, at least the current Google website. And if we wish, clicking back won't do anything quite yet, but we could enter in another website here. See, another website I'm a fan of would be stemkowski.net. Granted, I am a little biased. Then after entering that in our text field, clicking on the Go to URL button will go ahead and load that page for us. And within these pages, we can in fact click on links to go to other sites. Right? The web pages themselves are in fact fully functional. And clicking on the back button, we will in fact go back to previous sites. But the website works perfectly well. And since we set a preferred size for the web browser, you might notice that as we stretch and shrink the window, the size of the browser adapts and it fills the available space. Right, so that's a very basic WebView example. In a real application, you would probably want to maybe use images for these buttons, maybe align some things horizontally, so it looks more like a real functional website. The next example I'd like to show you is a slight variation. You can use a WebView to look at pages on the internet, but you can also use a WebView to look at locally stored HTML pages. The previous application was really only designed to work through the internet, but here is our second application, WebView Local. All right, as always, we extend the application class in our new class, WebView Local, and the public static void main is the same as it always is. We launch the application, and our boilerplate code hopefully is starting to look very familiar by now. We must implement a start method. This is another WebView example. This will be the title of our window. We'll arrange our contents with a VBox, a little bit of spacing in between, and increase the default font size. Then we attach our VBox to a scene and attach our scene to a stage. As before, we're going to begin by setting up a WebView object, and we'll give it a default size of 800 by 600 pixels. Again, we have just a little bit of boilerplate code to suppress potential warnings, and we have to set up a WebEngine object. As before, we get it directly from the browser which we have initialized. But this time, you'll notice we've commented out this code. We are not loading a default URL. Instead, we're going to load one from the user's system, and we'll determine what file should be loaded using the File Chooser class. We'll trigger the creation of a new File Chooser object, or the opening of a dialog window with a button, which again is called URL button. And this time it explains that it will be loading a local HTML file. When one clicks on that button, we need to set an action. That action begins by showing the open file dialog. It's parented to the main stage. Whatever the user chooses, we store that in a file. As always, when working with a file chooser, you have to be aware that the user could cancel or click on that red X instead of actually selecting a file. That's why we have these next two lines of code. If the user did not choose a file, then the file object will be null, in which case we should just return to the application. Otherwise, we'd like to parse the URL of that particular file. So I'll get the name of the file through this slightly long code, and then we'll go ahead and load that into the WebEngine. Of course, this could fail if we have an incorrectly named file or if we're not able to parse it. That's why we're using a try catch block. In case of an error, we'll print the stack trace. And then we just need to always remember to add our components, add our nodes to our layout manager, to our root. In this case, we really only have a button we click on to let us select a file, and the browser in which we display the file. That's really all there is to this example. At the end of the class, you always have to remember to show the stage object. Let's go ahead and give this a run and see what it looks like. So activating the main function. Again, a very simple application. In this case, the large empty white area is our WebView object when nothing's been loaded. We're going to go ahead and load a local HTML file. All right, so on the desktop, I actually have one stored. Let's see, sample.html. Again, a very simple HTML file, nothing too fancy. And this just contains the words, hello world, welcome to my web page, and a gold star. A gold star for effort, certainly not for sophistication. You might be wondering, what happens if you load something which is not an HTML file? Right? One thing you can always do is with your file chooser, if you wish, you could add an extension filter object to only allow the user to choose HTML files. But if I try to load something else, like perhaps, what if I tried to reload the code for this class? That's not going to work very well. So it might be a good idea to put that extension filter on to make a nice, usable bit of code. All right, now the WebView examples have shown us how to load a page from the internet and load a page from the local file system. You can actually do a lot more with these classes. There's two more examples I'd like to show you right now. In a future video, I think I'll show you even more. But for example, there's another class called Learn HTML. And I'll actually start by running this application first to show you what to expect. And then I'll go ahead and walk you through the code used to design this application. So again, I'm going to run the code for the Learn HTML class. All right, and right here, you might see that we have a text area, not a text field, but a text area in which you can type things. Then we get a blank white area to the right. If I start typing into the left and type hello world, and it looks like everything I'm typing on the left is being echoed on the other side. However, since this is the WebView video, it turns out that what's happening behind the scenes is that on the left, you can actually enter more than just text. You can also enter HTML code, HTML tags. For example, if I wanted to make the hello bold, I could surround that with a B tag. So beginning with within these angle brackets B, then the word hello, and then an angle brackets /B, that applies the bold formatting to just the word hello. And then after it, world appears again in a basic font. Again, there's lots of tags you can learn in HTML, like a U tag would underline some text. If you want to add in other things, I could add in an HR tag for horizontal rule. Could add in more than one of those. Hello world, say how are you? You might notice that this does not in fact skip to the next line. To do that, I would have to insert a break tag, BR. You can use different sizes. I could say, make an H1 tag. If I want to put the title up at the top. If I wanted to, I could also use a centering tag. If I wanted to only center the title, I could, for instance, change by adding an attribute to some of these. I could make a red horizontal rule. And there's other ways you can do this as well. But the purpose of this example, as you might guess, could be to teach someone how to learn HTML with an interactive, responsive application. It's not perfect because, well, if your code is not correctly formatted, it might appear incorrect. But this is another pretty nice use of the WebView object. So now that we understand what the application does, let's take a look at the code which is used to generate it, which, as is the case with many JavaFX applications, can be surprisingly efficient and short. All right, heading over to the Learn HTML application. As always, we're extending the application class. We have public static void main. Same boilerplate code to begin. We'll set a title for our application. In this application, you might have noticed that I really wanted the text area and the web view to be side by side. I think it's a little bit easier to read and compare the two. And that's why we're using an HBox for this particular application. Again, increasing the default font size. It's always a nice touch. Setting up the scene. And here comes our custom code. Right, first, we set up the different components. Again, setting up a new WebView object, name it browser. And this time, we have a window which is taller than it is wide. So the preferred size of this WebView is 400 pixels by 600 pixels. And again, in this case, we probably don't need this line of code because we're not actually loading an external website. However, we do still need a WebEngine object. And we're going to set up a text area with the same preferred size as our browser, 400 by 600. And we're using a text area rather than a text field because text areas support multi-line input. All right, next, we want the application to be responsive. So rather than, in this case, rather than having some kind of a button that we click to render the code on the left in the text area as HTML content on the right, instead of setting up some kind of responsive action in the button, in this case, we've added a listener to the text area. In this case, the text area has a property that registers when its data changes, and we can respond to that change by adding a listener. Again, we're going to use a Lambda expression for this listener. In this case, listening for changes in a property follows this general format. In this case, it's an observable value. In this case, it could extend a string, but in general, this will always work for an object. I'm using a very simple version of the listener because I'm really not going to do anything with the old value or the new value here. So I don't really care if I'm just calling these the most generic class object. All I really want to do is use the web engine to load the content, that is the text which is contained in the text area. That's pretty much it. That's our Lambda expression. It listens for changes. When changes occur, the web engine reloads the content. Every time you press a key, it's actually re-rendering that content. And then we always have to remember to add our objects. So in this case, adding the text area and the browser both to our HBox. So they get added and placed next to each other. And then we just need to show our application. That is it. That's all there is to that one. Again, you could clean this up. There's lots of wonderful features you could add to the application. You could add maybe a help menu. You could actually maybe add some documentation which says try this and try that. Right? We don't actually expect you to know HTML off the top of your head. That is the Learn HTML application. The last thing I want to show you is something that I hinted at in the WebView example. You might recall in the WebView example, there's one point at which there is this function attached to the web engine called execute script. And this is both an amazing and a scary line of code in that it's basically a programming language within a programming language. This bit of code is actually JavaScript code, which is getting stored in a string and being run by this web engine object. The next class I'm going to show you is a class called JavaScript Runner. The purpose of this particular class is to actually just run arbitrary code. Again, this needs to be used carefully. Arbitrary code execution is a dangerous thing, but usually web browsers, they do some sandboxing. They don't let you access your file system, which is a good thing. And here we have our public static void main. Again, a very basic application. Here's our boilerplate code. We've got our main stage with a title. We're going to set these objects up in an HBox so they display side by side, slightly increasing the font size. Next, we're going to set up our WebView object, as that is the theme of today's video. Again, here's our preferred size for the browser. And this looks a lot like the previous application, doesn't it? We have our web engine. Again, we don't really need this code right here. But we set up our web engine. We set up a text area right next to it. And here, we're going to have a result label that's going to display the result of the JavaScript code that we execute. There's going to be a button that says Run Code. And when one clicks on that button, we're going to go ahead and execute a script. We're going to get whatever was entered in that text area. We're going to execute it, and this time we're going to store the result as an object. And then we want to display that somewhere, so we'll convert the object to a string and set the text of the result label. So we're literally just executing some code right here. And then right here, what are we going to add to our application? Well, we need the area in which we can type in code. We need the run button we can click on, and we need the result label where we can display the result. You might notice in this case, we didn't actually add the web view to this application at all. We're really just using the underlying web engine here to run some code for us. And then when we're all done, as always, we do need to show the stage. Let's get this application running. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and run the JavaScript runner. Again, kind of a very simple, bare bones application. Still pretty cool though. Over here on the left-hand side, I might write 1 plus 2. Then I'll say run code. And sure enough, that is the result of 1 plus 2. That's the number 3. So here we had some text. Again, that was saved as a string, put into the web engine, and the result is right over here. I could do something else like, let's see, how complicated could I get? I could do something like if 2 is less than 1, maybe I'll say hello. Else goodbye. And so what's happening here? When this expression is run, this really isn't getting stored anywhere, right? This is just getting returned. 2 is not less than 1, and so this value gets returned. Right, so you can put compound expressions in here. That's why we're using a text area rather than a text field. Let's see, what would happen if we did something like a for loop? For loops in JavaScript are a little bit different than for loops in, say, Java. So for let n equals 0, notice I'm not saying int, but I'm saying let n less than 5, n plus plus, then I'll just say n. I'll run the code. Now, the interesting thing about this is really it's just returning, or it's printing the last value that was returned, right? So here, the for loop ran, and at the very end, the last output, the last result was 4. And so that's why we're seeing that there. You can do lots of interesting things. You could even have something like an array. Like you can have the array storing the numbers 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. And you'll actually see the contents of that array returned. Mostly, I think this is useful as just a simple expression parser. But again, it has some possibilities. All right, and those are just some examples of what you can do with a WebView class.